Hello there. Welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
Hey guys, it's Adam Kosh here, and over in London we have
Nick Butcher, hi.
So today we have a special episode dedicated entirely to the action bar design pattern. We unfortunately don't have any redesigns to do today, or we're not going to look at any specific apps, but we will talk in depth about the action bar. So with that, I guess we should just jump right in because we have a lot of content to go through. Adam, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, sure. So one quick thing before we get started. Nick may potentially be coming through on one audio channel only, so if you've got one earbud in your ear, maybe switch the other one if you can't hear him. So
in case you can't hear me.
In case you can. Potentially.
If you can't hear this.
Yes. So let's get started. We wanted to do a deep dive on the action bar today. So, the action bar. I had a couple of quotes here from the design guide, so I'm just going to quickly read them out. The action bar is a dedicated piece of real estate at the top of each screen that is generally persistent throughout the app. And the second quote, which I actually like better, the action bar is one of the most important design elements you can implement and will go a long way toward making your app's interface consistent with the core Android apps. So I think people ask, why should I implement the action bar? I'd rather go off and do some other design pattern. I think consistency is just really, really important, so that when users pick up your application, they instantly kind of know how to use it because they're so used to the system apps. So it's just a really, really important design pattern. If you've been listening to our show and hopefully you've been looking at the design side, hopefully you already know this.
Yeah, and the action bar, through all of the designs that we've done ourselves, we've always included an action bar. There are some cases where an action bar, it may not be necessary. Like for example, Google Now does not actually have an action bar in its top level screen. But if you notice, once you get into the detail screens, once you get into like the settings screen or things like that, there is an action bar. So there are some kind of edge cases where you may not need one, but almost certainly 99% of the time you should include one.
Yeah, I consider this one of those cases of deviate with purpose. Like, unless there's a really good reason, you probably want to be using one.
Definitely. All right, let's move along here. So the general organization, again, hopefully you're familiar with this already, but we just sort of thought we'd cover it again, the basics. So on the left portion of the action bar, you have your navigational elements, and then on the right side, the action. So it's pretty clearly split between the two sides. I think it's a very important pattern to follow this sort of general layout. If you do sort of decide to deviate in some way, shape or form, you should just always keep this in mind and try and stick to this if you possibly can.
Yeah, and actually one minor comment is I think in earlier versions of Honeycomb, the search button in some apps was actually on the left, and then we moved that over to the right as an action because that was really just a more common place, and we really wanted to standardize as search being an action rather than a navigational element. It can be portrayed, if you think about it logically, you can probably argue either way for search, but certainly the platform convention is to keep it as an action.
So we've got a bit more detail here around the general organization of the action bar. A very, very important piece, the app icon. So here you've sort of got your branding, your identity, and also it gives you sort of sense of place with this sort of up affordance that shows when you're at the not at the top level screens. So personally, I think people should always take advantage of the branding piece of this, not only because it sort of tells the user which application they're in when they're using it, but also, if they love the app, they're going to start to identify that branding with your application. Next time they're flicking through their home screen or in their sort of all apps list, they'll see that icon there and be like, hey, I haven't used that app in a while, and I really, really like that app, and they'll come back to it. So I think it's just really important. Sometimes I see people do custom implementations or a custom kind of action bar, but they don't include that branding. Personally, I feel very strongly that it's important.
One variation on that I'd like to just mention here is that quite commonly an application might have a single accent color which you strongly associate with that brand. So Dribbble might be pink, for example, and so forth. So there's also the opportunity to take the accent color as your action bar color altogether, and in that case I think it works really, really nicely to have a differentiated logo from your app icon. So it's entirely plausible and absolutely encouraged to have a different launcher icon that you might have in the launcher tray than the icon which appears in the top left of the action bar. So you might go for an inverted color, or maybe a single white simplified version of your icon, and then use the branding color in as the actual background of the action bar rather than having it compete for the same color.
And as long as the core icon itself is the same, as long as the shapes and the forms are really kind of the same thing as the launcher icon, you can definitely do that.
And of course, the YouTube app kind of does this with its launcher icon being different to the Action Bar app icon up there.
Yeah, and actually, I think they use a logo as well. So you don't necessarily have to use an icon there. If you have enough horizontal space available where you don't need other items like view controls, you can absolutely show a wider version. And for developers, that's called the Android logo for the Action Bar. But both the icon and the logo, those should be sufficient to convey the branding.
And it works really well. So if you have one natural homepage, like a newsfeed or something, which is the natural home of the content, you might want to provide greater branding, like say a larger logo, which takes up more width. And then on subsequent pages, you might want to collapse that back down to say a square aspect ratio icon, which will give you more room to display some kind of title information or view control.
Exactly, and that segues perfectly into the second part of the Action Bar, which is the view control. It can be used for navigation, something like a spinner, but also, as Nick mentioned, it can be used for sort of a title of the particular screen as well.
And the view control also encompasses tabs. So in some cases, especially on phones, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but tabs can go in that area, but in some cases they actually drop into a second lower area below that Action Bar as a stacked version. But tabs, spinner, and titles, we consider those kind of view controls, things that let you see information about the current context, the current screen, as well as potentially kind of tweak things like change the sorting, or actually not necessarily the sorting, change the perspective or like the label or something that you're looking at.
Cool, and then as you mentioned on the right side, you've got your actions. So you've got the action buttons there. In this case, there's a search and a record video action, followed by what we call the action overflow menu. So this is where less frequently used actions can be collapsed into an overflow menu that's not always visible on the screen.
And there, very importantly for the overflow, there are also some platform conventions on what things should always go there. So if you have application settings, as well as help and about, terms of service, things like that should go in the overflow. You shouldn't make those immediately on screen, unless something like settings is like the #1 use case for your app, like if everybody is just tweaking the settings. But in almost 99% of cases, overflow should contain settings as well.
All right, moving along.
Is it worth mentioning about the overflow then? Sorry, just before you do move
No,
on.
go for it.
If we're talking about the case of devices which have a physical menu button, then the overflow button won't necessarily display, so you're going to rely on that physical affordance rather than the on-screen affordance.
Yep, good point. And I think we have a screenshot later on to sort of show how that works.
No, jumping the gun, sorry.
No worries. So the other nice thing about the Action Bar is it's very good at adapting to different screen sizes, rotations, actually the width of the screen. It's very, very good at adapting to that. So it does a few things to help with the variation in screen sizes. And actually, I think it's the next slide. One particular thing that you can do is engage this mode called Split Action Bar mode. And actually, from a developer standpoint, it's a flag called Split Action Bar when narrow. So it sort of says when the screen width gets down to a certain point, we're going to go into this Split Action Bar mode instead. So in Split Action Bar mode, you've sort of got three potential different bars that you can have here. You've got the main action bar at the top. You've got the top bar, which Roman was talking about before, is where the tabs could potentially fall down to. And then at the bottom of the screen, you've got the bottom bar, very creatively named here, the bottom bar, top bar. And you'll see that at the bottom bar, in the bottom bar, you've got the action items, which have now moved down there, along with trailing off into the overflow menu, rather than being at the top right there in the main action bar.
And a couple more points on this screen. You'll notice that the concept of like navigation versus action, the separation of the two, is still in play, except that spatially it's no longer horizontal, it's purely vertical. At the top you have all of your navigational affordances and elements, and at the very bottom you have your actions. So that pattern is still kept in check. The other thing I wanted to mention was actually on the previous screen. Not only is the scalability, like the stretchiness of the action bar important on different devices, but you'll also notice that on tablets, the action bar is actually slightly taller, the app icon is displayed slightly larger, and the action bar buttons are slightly wider. So an action bar button on a phone may be something like 56 dips wide. On a tablet, I think it's about 64 dips. And then the action bar height, I think it's something like 48, and then on tablets, it's 56 or something like that. But again, this stuff changes, this stuff may change. So just using the standard action bar gives you all of this for free.
Yeah, and if potentially some huge tablet comes out in the future or something like that, the action bar may have a different size again and different way of formatting, but as long as you stick to using the action bar, your applications should still sort of look and display fine here.
One more, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Contextual action bar. Nick, do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So the contextual action bar is one of my favorite tricks. So it has the ability to kind of transform its appearance to give you contextual actions to what's on screen. So in this screenshot here, we can see examples of selecting text or selecting an email message, where the same physical space kind of like animates and rotates around and offers alternate actions. And the contextual action bar really is a first-class citizen, like the standard action bar, and you can still do things like the split action bar. So if you have a plethora of options that you want to have immediately available on screen without having to dip down into the overflow, you can go into that split mode, like the Mail app is there, and show those things immediately. And if you want to know more about contextual action bar, we actually did a deep dive on this a couple of months back, so you can go back through the archives into the video messaging contextual action bar.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that generally it's engaged by long pressing on a particular element of the screen. So in this example, I think we have browser and then Gmail or email. Mm-hmm. In some cases, though, there can be a UI element that you could touch upon to engage it. So in this case, in Gmail, it's a checkbox that you could touch that checkbox, and the contextual action bar triggers at that point.
The other important thing to note about contextual action bars is that conceptually and just logically, they're a mode, right? So when you select something, you're basically entering into a UI mode, and that mode is, something is selected. So what happens is, the context of the screen, the layout of the screen doesn't really change. Like for example, in Gmail's case, the list items are still there, but the action bar, basically kind of like the chrome around the content, changes to reflect what mode you're in. And then once you kind of cancel out of that mode by either pressing the back button or pressing the check mark in the top left, that cancels the mode, that exits the mode, and then you're back to kind of what the screen normally was. So just think of it as a UI mode almost.
So moving on to the second portion of the action bar that we were talking about, the view controls. So one possible option to show there in the view control section are tabs. And there's sort of two main categories of tabs. There's fixed tabs and scrollable tabs, and there's a couple of examples there on the slides that you can see. I personally really like fixed tabs, where they're appropriate, just because it's really, really quick and easy to flip between the different views. Obviously, they're only appropriate when you've got maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 items, different views that you want to flip between. And obviously you should always enable swipe to navigate between those different tabs. Then you've also got scrollable tabs where you could potentially have any number of different views that you're switching between. It could be a known number but larger number than say the 3 or 4 that fixed tabs support, or it could be an unknown number that you don't know how many are sort of going to trail off there. So here's an example from the Play Store.
Yeah. So one thing to note is that if you're a developer and you're trying to implement this, it's actually called a pager title strip. It's kind of a misnomer. We call them scrollable tabs on the design side because logically and from a kind of a mental model perspective, they serve the same purpose as tabs. It's just like from an interaction standpoint, they're slightly different. So one of the key differences is that you don't see them all at once, and they're slightly thinner, so they're not really a touch target. They're really more an indicator, but usually they are coupled with touch. So in case the user does touch that area, that indicates the next page or the previous page, you should still kind of swipe over or switch over.
Yeah, and in terms of how it fits in with the action bar, in that split action bar mode, these fixed tabs will actually take up the whole width below the main action bar, and so will the scrollable tabs. But when there's more room, for example, in a landscape mode or on a tablet, those fixed tabs can actually fall in line with the main action bar, whereas the scrollable tabs really need to take up the entire width of the screen.
And another option, when we were talking about the different bars you can have, so you can have your main action bar, your top bar, and then a bottom bar. In some cases, having a top action bar as well as the stacked tab bar doesn't add anything, so it's entirely valid to hide the top action bar if it's not really adding anything to your design and you want to free up some more content area for your app. So if you take a look at, for example, the dialer application or contacts applications that ship with ICS Plus devices, you can see there they've hidden the top action bar and just had the free fixed tabs right at the top to free up some room.
And another example of that from the third-party space is Pinterest. And I wouldn't say that they exactly use tabs. I mean, they look and feel like tabs. You can swipe between them, and there are 3 of them, so they kind of represent tabs. They're very similar to like the People app tabs or such. But that's another example. So it's an example of where the widths aren't equal. The home tab in the Pinterest app is default selected. So it's a slight variation, but again, it's a deviation with a purpose. They wanted to simplify things, and I think that it's a fairly good execution.
So moving on, view controls, you can also have spinners and drawers. I don't think we're going to spend too long in here because we know there's a lot of discussion about drawers still, and the patterns are still not finalized on the design side. But just to quickly mention it, both of them are sort of ways to switch between views. A spinner is a drop-down pop-up kind of dialogue that drops down from the top of the action bar, which allows you to switch between views. The navigation drawer slides out from the side, and the YouTube app is sort of the main example of how to implement a navigation drawer at this point in time. I don't know, do you guys want to mention anything more about this? We could probably talk about drawers versus spinners for much longer than half an hour.
At a high level, I'd say just looking at the different options, tabs, spinner, navigation drawer. When you look at these elements, I mean, they're functionally somewhat equivalent. There are some minor differences in terms of when you should use a spinner versus navigation drawer, as well as when it's appropriate to use tabs versus spinner. But functionally, they're lateral navigation elements, so they let you navigate across sibling elements or sibling screens. And then it's kind of interesting to look at the action bar's navigational components as both ancestral navigation and lateral navigation. So the up button, which we made brief mention of, lets you accomplish ancestral navigation, lets you walk up the structure of an app, versus tabs or spinners or navigation drawers. They let you navigate laterally across the structure of your app. So when you're planning out, how do you design an app that uses all these different navigational elements? Think about your app in terms of a screen map, or think about it in terms of a structure, a tree almost, a hierarchical structure, and see where you can introduce elements to better convey that structure to your users.
Yeah, one thing I will quickly say is I very much dislike it when a drawer has 3 items in it, because it could much better be represented by something like regular tabs, and it gives the user the on-screen visuals immediately there. It can swipe it to them. It's just so much easier. So
yeah,
it's one pet peeve of mine.
One of the other things, since we're on the topic of tabs,
I knew we were going to get stuck on this.
Yeah, tabs are important. One of the things that's different between Android and other platforms is tabs aren't persistent. So this is one thing that I have seen some folks get caught up with. They keep tabs visible throughout the entire app. So the action bar is really the one thing that should really be present throughout the entire app, because it gives you access to the up button as well as things like settings and whatnot. But tabs are really a per screen type thing. So if your top level screen has tabs, once you get into a detail screen from within one of those tabs, like let's say you touch a list item in tab 1, you should hide those tabs. And then to get back to those tabs, the user should press up to get to the top level screen that has those tabs. So that's one thing to make sure that you don't do, is have hierarchy and history within a tab. A tab is really just like a segment of the screen almost.
Yeah, the action bar is the anchor of the application. It should be visible all the time, and the other elements should sort of come and go as needed.
Yeah.
All right, let's get away from this before we get
Absolutely.
Action buttons. Nick, do you want to?
Yeah. So action buttons are the right-hand section of the action bar, which allow you to perform actions which are contextual to the content on screen. We kind of use this fit rule, which you can see on screen here, to determine which actions should appear like front and center right on the action bar, and which ones are less important and should be like tucked away under the overflow menu. So the fit scheme, it refers to something which is frequent, important, or typical. So if just some examples of that. Frequently, if you in an image viewing application like the gallery, for example, you frequently want to share that. So we have the share action button right front and center in the action bar. So it's very easy to do that, achieve that. something which is important. So in an email application, we have the send button in the action bar because it's right there at the top of the screen is the most important thing. And one more thing, if there is one single, the most important action on the screen, try and keep it to the leftmost action because that's more likely to be shown on the action bar and not tucked away under the overflow if there isn't sufficient room. And the last of the rules is typical. So something like search, as we touched on slightly earlier on, you're going to always look to the top right to look for the search action because it's typically found there. So you want to follow that rule. And one thing I'd just like to kind of clarify on that is we've called out at the bottom here saying that items in the action bar need to be unambiguous as to what they're going to apply to. So if there's something like an edit action in the action bar, but there's actually a couple of distinct groups of content on the screen, so it's unclear, you want to basically put that action inline in the content area so that there's no ambiguity. You want to either do that inline, or you could perhaps use the contextual action bar in that instance to enable some mode to then perform the action on an individual piece of content. And the other thing we wanted to call out here is to really try and reuse people's mental models for these very well-established actions. So something like search or edit or share has these very well-known kind of glyphs associated with these actions. So you want to be using the platform default one. So take a look at there's a download on the design site, the action bar download pack, as well as the brilliant Asset Studio, which will help you to kind of find or kind of slightly hint these icons to your color scheme and so forth.
The other very minor thing on that is that don't feel that you're restricted to use the styling, hollow dark or hollow light styling for the action bar buttons. If you have a very, very branded, action bar or a very branded app in general that has, its own color scheme, maybe even some, some minor visual effects here and there, just as long as you use the core iconography, and the core iconography you can get with the Illustrator files that come with that download. Just apply your styling on top of those Illustrator files so that you still use the same iconography, not necessarily the same styling.
Yeah, and one last thing I just wanted to mention was don't feel like you have to put actions necessarily in the action bar. You can put them inline as well. That's definitely an alternate option. If it's relevant to the content or it sort of fits better with the flow of the screen, you could possibly put something inline. It's definitely another option. But if that's not what you want, if you want to stick to the sort of standard pattern, put them in the action bar. All right.
So we kind of touched on this earlier on as well about the. You're not actually saying this item, must show. I think the whole point of the action bar is it really helps you to build on this responsive design technique that we were always talking about. Android is designed for scale, and you don't necessarily know at design time how wide the device is going to be which your app is running on. Is it in landscape? Is it in portrait? Is it like a tablet-sized device? So the action bar is really built with that in its underpinnings, and so. The way you define your actions, you actually can say if it should always show up in the action bar and never kind of go under the overflow menu. If it should, or conversely, never. So something like settings, you would say never show this as a front and center action. Pop this on the overflow. And the last one, the most interesting one, you probably want to use for most of your actions, is just to say if room. So what that will say is that if there's room, please display this, and otherwise tuck it under. And the system will go through in the order in which you've defined your actions and kind of try and show as many as it can, and then any it doesn't have room for will get tucked under the overflow. So it really kind of, you want to be thinking about your actions and say, something like an email application, send should always be on the screen, but these other things are less important, and they can go underneath the overflow if need be. And so don't get hung up on thinking these two things are always going to be on the screen, these things are always going to be off screen. Try and work with the if room and try and have this kind of stretchable design if you can.
Yeah, I really like this because it forces you to think about the fit pattern that we were talking about before, and just really prioritize which actions you think are most important. If a user has the Nexus S and they can only fit 2 items up there, then you're always going to have the 2 items that you think were most important be visible to you, to the user. So I think it's a good way of decluttering your UI almost. It sort of forces you to tackle that problem rather than just say, hey, I'll throw everything on the screen and hope the user can work out what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we better get moving here, guys.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly jump through key styles for branding. So you've seen this through our various designs throughout the show, but the key things that you should think about when styling the action bar, and outside of just picking color schemes, you can obviously also apply patterns or subtle gradients and just solid colors to these. You should really be thinking about the action bar's core background. That's kind of the number one way you can brand things. If you're Yahoo, it should probably be purple or something like that. For the stacked bar background, you probably want to use a very similar shade or a similar hue, but a slightly darker, slightly lighter version. The reason you don't want to do something too crazy is that, again, in landscape, your tabs can actually stack up into the top bar, and so the tabs may not have enough contrast if there's a completely different color palette between the action bar background and the stacked background. You can probably make it work through some tricks here and there, but it's generally easiest if you just make a slight variation to the background for the stacked top bar. Also, the selected tab strip, that's where you can really kind of show your brand's accent color if you have a secondary color in your palette, as well as the press state background. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. If your action bar background is blue, the default press state background for the action bar is also going to be blue. If you touch an icon or if you touch the up button, it's going to be blue background, so the contrast may not be very good. So make sure to tweak that and keep it into account for that.
And for developers, there's an article on the Android developers blog on how to achieve these kind of styling techniques.
What was it? j.mp/customizing action bar? Or I think you just search for Nick Butcher customizing the action bar. You'll get
Yeah, I forget.
All right.
And then there's the really awesome action bar style generator tool for developers that you can basically just create all the assets you need right from this tool. Really awesome tool. We use it in a lot of our samples.
There's an additional style called action bar overlay style that you can use if, say, the content is just so important in this particular screen. You can really make the action bar and the sort of system Chrome fade out a little bit here. So there's two examples here. One is Google Maps on the right there. And you can see, the map is obviously just the most important thing within an application like Google Maps. And so you can see it's transparent, allowing the map to sort of bleed through a little bit there. It looks really, really nice. And then the system gallery is another great example, which we're using right now. And one thing you should do is if, something like gallery where the user may want to see the picture without any other sort of Chrome visible, touching the screen should really make the action bar come on screen and then disappear again.
Along with the status bar.
And potentially the status bar as well, and the system controls down the bottom. That's not really possible with something like photo viewing, but with video viewing you can actually make the entire thing go full screen.
And there's for developers out there, there's a template that you can use with Eclipse. So if you do File, New, and then Android Object, you can choose Full Screen Activity, and it gives you all this for free.
Cool. Okay, we got to move along.
Yes, let's dive through.
Custom action views. Nick, you want to take us through? Very quick.
Yeah, sure. So
you got 5 words.
Action buttons don't just have to be kind of just buttons. They can be a little bit more interactive and responsive than that. So here's a few examples of the stock ones. So you have a common pattern is to transform a refresh icon into an indeterminate progress spinner. So you can, using the same space, indicate progress or an action, which is great. Another common one is the search action provider. So this is a way to, when you click on a search action, have it expand out to kind of like take over the action bar's physical space, similar to how the contextual action bar will, in order to provide the search affordance, which is a great little pattern. And the last one we called out here is the share action providers. This is an excellent way of providing a ordered list of the way someone wants to share. So if I always go to certain couple of apps, they'll actually float to the top of the list. And in fact, the most commonly used app to share that certain media type will be right persistent in the action bar. So it's very easy. So you can have this richer behavior from the action buttons, not just simple buttons.
Cool, excellent. And then I think Nick was talking about this briefly before, but some devices still have a hard menu button. And so in that case, the overflow menu actually doesn't show in the action bar. And instead, when you hit the device hard menu or legacy menu button, the additional overflow items will pop up from the bottom. So you can see that here on the Nexus S versus the Nexus 4, where the overflow menu still pops up those same options. Not gonna I think we just got to keep.
Yeah, that's fine.
Let's keep done this guide. You want to
And
quickly?
yeah,
You
lastly,
don't have to do anything to get this behavior. That comes from free from the
Yes,
system.
very
So,
good point.
Yes.
So use the native action bar.
right. And lastly, done and discard. This is something that's not yet documented. I think we'll probably be documenting in the future. But as an alternative, if you have a really simple screen, like for example, like just a single screen edit or single edit screen or something, and you really only have two things you can do, right? You can either save or cancel, and you don't want to use a dialogue because generally you want to avoid dialogues. You want to avoid the extra burden on the user to think about what else is around the screen. You can use the done/discard pattern, where basically instead of an action bar, instead of the up button, instead of kind of a title and overflow, you just show two actions, done and discard. And there's, again, positive button on the right, negative button on the left. Alternatively, if discarding is not really that common, or if you have other actions you need to show, you can just show done in the top left, which takes the place of the up button. And that's kind of like the same thing as saying, if I press this, I have the added confidence that when I go up or when I leave this context, I'm actually persisting my content, my changes. So that's just an alternative that you can use for very simple screens.
Cool. And then design news, we're gonna have to
Fly through
it.
This is from the developer of, I think it was a Carbon for Android. He had a bunch of thoughts on Holo and what it means, what is the language, how as a designer are you using it, are you elaborating on it. So just a couple of thoughts here as a Google Plus post, definitely worth reading if you're designing for Android.
And lastly, here is a regular contributor, Marie Schweitz, has given a great walkthrough of her mental process that she goes through, the workflow she goes through when she's designing an application. So it's, you don't dive straight into your pixel editing tool of choice, but she kind of walks through the concepting behind it and thinking about the information hierarchy. And this post was really great, and it's a good insight into how other people work.
Cool.
And we're done.
Yeah, with that. Thanks again for joining us here on Android Design in Action, where we talked about the action bar, everything you needed to know. As always, I'm Roman Nurik.
Adam Kosh.
Nick Butcher.
See you guys.
See you next week or whatever. See you guys.
Bye.